For 64 years, Rosemary Kennedy sat by the same window, waiting for a family that would never come. Every morning she would wake up with the same routine, sit in the same chair, and look out at the gardens of St. Coletta Institution in Wisconsin. The caregivers loved her, but none of them really knew who she was. The lost daughter of the Kennedy family, the biggest secret in American politics, was known here simply as Rosemary, silent, gentle, forgotten Rosemary. When she was brought to this institution in 1941 at the age of 23, she had no idea that what her family told her was temporary care would become her permanent home for the rest of her life. She could still speak then, could form simple sentences and express basic needs and desires. But the lobotomy had so devastated her mind that understanding the outside world was nearly impossible, like trying to see clearly through shattered glass that would never be repaired. The procedure that was supposed to calm her had instead stolen her very essence, leaving behind a hollow shell of the vibrant young woman she had once been. The first years were very difficult for everyone involved. Rosemary constantly searched for her home, called for her mother in broken fragments of words, murmured her siblings' names like a prayer she couldn't remember learning. "Where is Jack? Where is Joe?" she would ask the nuns with the confusion of someone who knew something was missing but couldn't understand what. They would kindly say, "They'll come soon," lying with the gentle mercy that sometimes passed for kindness in institutions. But no one was coming, and deep down, the nuns began to understand that no one ever would. The Kennedy family had made their choice, prioritizing political ambition over their daughter's humanity. The nuns of St. Coletta showed special compassion for Rosemary from the very beginning. They knew instinctively that she was different from their ordinary patients, though they were never told the full truth about who she was or why she was there. They realized her family was important people based on the expensive clothes she wore and the quality of her medical care, but for reasons they couldn't understand, these important people never visited her. There was an air of mystery around this young woman that the sisters found both heartbreaking and puzzling. Sister Margaret, the head nun who cared for Rosemary in her early years, had developed a special routine designed specifically to bring some comfort to this lost young woman. Rosemary loved music more than anything else in her limited world. It was like a piece of memory left over from when she used to be able to sing, when her voice had filled rooms with joy instead of broken whispers. Sister Margaret would play simple songs for her on an old piano in the common room, and Rosemary would hum along with a voice that was broken, but still trying to find its melody. During these musical moments, her eyes would sometimes focus with an intensity that suggested deeper memories struggling to surface. These were her happiest moments, when something deep inside her remembered what it felt like to be whole. The music seemed to unlock fragments of her former self, brief glimpses of the vibrant young woman she had once been. As the years passed relentlessly, Rosemary changed in ways that broke the hearts of those who cared for her. Her ability to speak was almost completely lost, stolen along with so much else by the surgery that had been meant to help her. She could only say simple words when pressed: water, food, music. These basic needs became the entirety of her vocabulary, though sometimes at night the staff would hear her murmuring sounds that might have been names or songs or prayers. But there was still something in her eyes that hadn't been destroyed, couldn't be destroyed by any surgical procedure. An effort to understand, a desire to belong somewhere, a spark of the person she had been before November 1941. The caregivers learned to recognize and cherish that little smile that appeared on her face when they showed her kindness, when they acknowledged her as more than just another patient to be managed. It was in that smile that traces of the real Rosemary Kennedy survived, the young woman who had once wanted nothing more than to make her family proud. The tragedy wasn't just what had been done to her, but what continued to be done to her every day through absence, through the silence of people who should have loved her enough to sit by her window and hold her hand. The daily routine at St. Coletta became Rosemary's entire universe, a small world bounded by institutional schedules and the limitations of her damaged mind. Every morning at 7 sharp, Sister Catherine would help her get dressed, a process that required infinite patience and gentle guidance. Rosemary had forgotten how to button her clothes, tie her shoes, brush her hair, all the small tasks that once came as naturally as breathing. Tasks that any child could master now required careful assistance, but she never resisted, never showed frustration. She was always compliant, always gentle, as if some part of her still remembered being the obedient Kennedy daughter who wanted to please everyone around her. Breakfast was always exactly the same. Oatmeal with brown sugar, buttered toast cut into triangles, and orange juice in a plastic cup she could hold without dropping. Rosemary would eat slowly, mechanically, sometimes stopping mid-bite as if listening for something only she could hear. The staff noticed that she often turned toward the window during meals, her eyes focused on the driveway that wound through the trees toward the outside world. They realized with growing sadness that she was still waiting, that even after years of abandonment, some part of her mind held on to the hope that someone would come for her. This daily vigil by the window became the most heartbreaking aspect of her routine, a constant reminder of the family that had erased her from their lives. The most heartbreaking moments for the staff came on Sundays, when other residents received visitors. Families would arrive with flowers, photographs, news from the world beyond institutional walls. Children would run to grandparents, spouses would embrace after a week apart, and normal family life would briefly transform the sterile visiting room into something warm and alive. Rosemary would watch these reunions from her wheelchair, positioned by the window, her face showing a confusion that the staff found devastating to witness. Why didn't her family come? In her limited understanding, she couldn't comprehend abandonment or rejection or the complex calculations that had led to her exile. She only knew that something essential was missing from her life, something that other people had, but she was denied. The emptiness in her expression during these visiting days became a source of profound sorrow for everyone who cared about her. Sister Margaret tried desperately to fill this void with activities designed to engage whatever remained of Rosemary's consciousness. She discovered that Rosemary loved feeling different textures, spending long minutes running her hands over soft blankets, smooth stones from the garden, the rough bark of trees during supervised outdoor time. She would repeat these tactile experiences over and over, finding some comfort in sensation that her damaged brain could still process and enjoy. Music remained her greatest joy, though her responses became more basic and instinctive over time. When someone played piano in the common room, her face would brighten with something approaching recognition, and sometimes she would sway slightly in her wheelchair, her body remembering rhythms her mind could no longer name. These musical moments were precious glimpses into the person she had once been, before the surgery had stolen so much of her essence. Physical care became increasingly important and complex as Rosemary aged and her condition deteriorated. She needed help with bathing, eating, even walking as her coordination gradually failed her. The staff treated her with unwavering dignity, always speaking to her as if she could understand everything they said, even when it was clear that words had become meaningless sounds. "Good morning, Rosemary. It's a beautiful day today." "The birds are singing in the garden," Sister Catherine would say each morning with genuine warmth, though Rosemary rarely responded with more than a brief look or the ghost of a smile. The institution kept meticulous records of Rosemary's condition and daily routine, documenting her decline with clinical precision. Year after year, decade after decade, the notes were similar. Patient remains calm and cooperative, no visitors this month, enjoys music therapy, requires full assistance with all daily activities. The clinical language couldn't capture the true tragedy of a life lived in suspended animation, of human potential that had been surgically removed, of a woman who existed in a permanent state of waiting for a rescue that would never come. Behind those sterile medical notes was the story of someone who had once danced at debutante balls, who had written letters from London, who had trusted completely in her family's love. The seasons changed outside Rosemary's window year after year, but inside St. Coletta, time seemed frozen in an eternal present that offered neither growth nor real change. Spring brought new flowers to the garden that Rosemary could see but couldn't name or fully appreciate. Summer meant longer days spent by the window, watching birds whose songs she heard but couldn't identify. Fall painted the trees in brilliant colors that briefly captured her attention, before fading from her damaged memory like everything else. Winter wrapped the world in white silence that perfectly matched the silence that had settled over her mind and voice. The staff began to notice disturbing patterns in Rosemary's behavior that took years for them to understand. On certain days throughout the year, she seemed more agitated than usual, more restless, turning repeatedly toward the window as if expecting something that never materialized. It took the observant nuns years to realize that these episodes of increased anxiety coincided with family birthdays, holidays, and anniversaries. Somehow, buried deep in her subconscious beneath layers of surgical damage, she retained a sense of when something important should be happening, when people should be gathering, when she should not be alone in this institutional purgatory. Christmas was particularly difficult for everyone who cared about Rosemary. The institution would decorate a small artificial tree in the common room, and families would visit with wrapped gifts and excited children. The building would fill with the sounds of celebration, laughter, and love that transformed the usually sterile environment into something approaching normal family life. Rosemary would sit in her wheelchair near the tree, watching the celebrations with an expression that Sister Margaret later described as profound loneliness made visible. The staff would give her small gifts carefully chosen for someone with her limitations, a soft scarf in her favorite blue color, a music box that played simple melodies, a stuffed animal she could hold. But she couldn't connect these tokens to any larger meaning or tradition, couldn't understand why this day was different from any other in her endless routine. In the 1960s, when her brother John became President of the United States, the staff noticed increased attention from security personnel around the institution, though they were never told why. Men in dark suits would occasionally drive slowly past the building, never stopping, never visiting, just observing from a distance. The nuns were given strict instructions that Rosemary was to receive the best possible care available, that no expense should be spared for her comfort and medical needs. Money flowed freely for her care, but the most important thing, human connection with her family, remained completely absent. The irony was heartbreaking, as her brother reached the pinnacle of American political power, speaking eloquently about caring. For society's most vulnerable members, his own sister remained hidden away, forgotten, receiving excellent physical care, but starved of the love and recognition she desperately needed. Eunice Kennedy Shriver began visiting regularly in the early 1960s, becoming the first and only family member to maintain contact with Rosemary after decades of abandonment. These visits brought both joy and confusion to Rosemary's severely limited world. She didn't recognize Eunice as her sister, couldn't connect this kind stranger to memories that had been surgically severed, but she sensed something familiar in her presence, something that stirred feelings too deep and too damaged to surface into consciousness. Eunice would sit with her sister for hours at a time, talking about their childhood in voices soft enough not to overwhelm her, about their mother Rose and their happy times at Hyannis Port, about a world that Rosemary could no longer access, but might still somehow remember in the deepest parts of her damaged brain. Sometimes during these visits, Rosemary would reach out tentatively and touch Eunice's face with her fingertips, a gesture that never failed to bring tears to her sister's eyes. These were the only moments when Rosemary seemed truly present, truly connected to something beyond her institutional routine of meals and medications and endless waiting. For Eunice, these visits were both penance and connection, a way to honor the sister who had been sacrificed for family ambition, and perhaps the only genuine love Rosemary experienced during her decades of exile. As decades turned into half a century, Rosemary became woven into the very fabric of institutional life at St. Coletta. New staff members would learn about the quiet woman in room 12 who never had visitors except for one devoted sister who came regularly. They were told to treat her with special care and attention, though they were never told the full truth about why she deserved such consideration. To the younger caregivers, she was simply an elderly resident who needed gentle handling, infinite patience, and the kind of dignity that should be afforded to every human being regardless of their limitations. The outside world changed dramatically during Rosemary's long exile at St. Coletta, transforming in ways she could never understand or appreciate. The disability rights movement revolutionized how society viewed people with intellectual differences, replacing shame and institutionalization with acceptance and community integration. Laws were passed protecting the rights of individuals with developmental disabilities, ensuring they could live with dignity and respect. Large institutions began closing across the country as community-based care became the preferred standard. But Rosemary remained exactly where she had always been, in her familiar chair by the window, unaware that a revolution was happening in her name and because of her story. The staff noticed that over the years, Rosemary had developed her own unique form of communication that didn't rely on words she could no longer form. She would touch objects gently to indicate basic wants or needs, move slowly toward things that interested her, show clear preferences through body language that the experienced caregivers learned to read like a specialized dialect. She particularly loved being outdoors on warm days, sitting in the garden where she could feel sunlight warming her face and hear the sounds of life continuing around her, birds singing songs she couldn't identify but somehow still appreciated. These outdoor moments seemed to awaken something primal and peaceful within her, connecting her to a world beyond institutional walls in ways that nothing else could achieve. Medical care became increasingly complex and demanding as Rosemary aged and her body began to fail along with her mind. She developed arthritis that made movement painful, though she rarely complained or showed distress. Her vision and hearing declined steadily, further narrowing her already limited world and cutting off more of her connections to her surroundings. Yet, the staff consistently remarked on her extraordinary resilience, her ability to find small moments of contentment and even joy within such a restricted and institutional existence. Sister Catherine, who cared for Rosemary during her final decades and knew her better than anyone, often spoke about her patient's inherent dignity that somehow survived everything that had been done to her. She never lost that quality, Sister Catherine would say to visitors and new staff members. Even when she couldn't remember her own name or recognize her own reflection, there was something regal about her, something that spoke to who she had been before the surgery destroyed her personality. You could see it in the way she held herself, the way she responded to kindness, the way she never lost her gentle nature despite everything. The most poignant and heartbreaking moments came when Rosemary would sometimes hum fragments of melodies from her distant childhood, musical memories that had somehow been preserved despite the extensive brain damage. These songs, emerging from the ruins of her consciousness like flowers growing through concrete, were her last real connections to the vibrant young woman she had once been. The staff would encourage these precious moments, playing simple songs on the radio and watching with wonder as Rosemary's face would light up with something approaching recognition, even if she couldn't understand what she was recognizing or why it made her feel something resembling happiness. In her 80s, as her body continued to fail, Rosemary's world became even smaller and more confined. She could no longer sit by her beloved window for long periods, could barely communicate even through the gestures that had become her language. But the devoted staff continued to treat her with unwavering love and respect, reading to her from simple books, playing the music she had always loved, ensuring that her final years were filled with as much comfort and dignity as their limited resources could provide. They understood that they were caring for someone who had been forgotten by the world that should have remembered her, and they were determined to honor her humanity in ways her own family had failed to do. Rosemary Kennedy died peacefully on January 7, 2005, at the age of 86, surrounded by the nuns and caregivers who had become the only family she had known for most of her life. She had spent 64 years at St. Coletta, longer than she had lived anywhere else, longer than she had experienced any other existence. The staff who cared for her in those final days spoke of a gentle passing, free from the agitation and confusion that had marked so much of her institutional life. In death, she finally found the peace that had been stolen from her in 1941. When news of her death reached the Kennedy family, scattered across the country in their various pursuits, it marked the end of their longest-kept secret and their deepest source of shame. For 64 years, they had lived with the knowledge of what they had done to her, carrying the collective guilt of a decision that could never be undone, a sister and daughter who had been sacrificed for political ambition and social acceptability. Her obituary in major newspapers across the country was respectfully brief, mentioning her intellectual disability and her indirect role in inspiring the Special Olympics through her sister Eunice's advocacy work. But these sanitized accounts couldn't capture the profound tragedy of a life lived entirely in shadows, hidden from the world that should have celebrated her simply for being human. The real story wasn't just about the lobotomy performed on Rosemary in 1941, but about what wasn't done for her in all the decades that followed, the failure to visit regularly, to offer comfort in her confusion, to acknowledge her existence as worthy of family love and connection. Sister Catherine, who had cared for Rosemary for over 30 years and knew her better than her own family ever had, spoke at her simple memorial service with words that captured what others had missed. Rosemary taught us about patience, about finding joy in the smallest things, about maintaining dignity in the face of profound loss and limitation. She never understood why she was here, why she had been separated from everything familiar, but she made this place better simply by being in it. Her gentleness touched everyone who cared for her. The woman who had once danced at debutante balls in elegant gowns, who had tried so desperately to please her ambitious family, who had trusted completely in their love and protection, was laid to rest in a simple ceremony attended by the people who had actually known and cared for her in her final decades. Few flowers marked her passing, fewer visitors attended her funeral, a quiet end to a life that had been lived in enforced quietude. But Rosemary's legacy extended far beyond her own suffering and the family's shame. The Special Olympics, founded in large part because of Eunice's guilt over her sister's treatment, had changed millions of lives around the world. Laws protecting people with disabilities could often trace their inspiration back to families who had learned from the Kennedy example of what not to do when faced with difference and challenge. Medical ethics standards had been completely rewritten because of cases like hers, ensuring that no other person could be subjected to such procedures without full understanding and consent. In death, Rosemary Kennedy finally received the recognition and respect that had been systematically denied to her throughout her life. Her story became a powerful reminder of the critical importance of protecting society's most vulnerable members, of the terrible danger of placing image and reputation above basic humanity, of the lasting consequences when families abandon their own out of shame, fear, or misplaced priorities. The window where she had sat faithfully for 64 years, waiting patiently for a family that never came, became a powerful symbol for advocates and families around the world. It represented all the forgotten people who have been hidden away in institutions when they became inconvenient to those who should have loved them most, and it challenged everyone to choose love over shame, acceptance over abandonment, humanity over image. Her silence, which had lasted more than 6 decades, finally found its voice in the millions of people who refused to let her story be forgotten. Today, disability rights advocates invoke her name when fighting for inclusion and acceptance, her tragic example serving as a reminder of how far society has come and how far it still needs to go.